So this is a topic I've been studying for a few months, and I wanted to present for your critique. I have a way that I'm leaning on this topic. I present it to our fellowship group that we're with, and was looking for feedback, looking for your comments. I know you asked for you to mute yourselves, but we're going to be having some interaction here, so I want to make sure that you're free to speak in at any point. I'm going to begin by going through a few slides that's going to have some questions on them. I'm going to run through them. I don't want you to respond immediately because I'm going to then come back to them, and to each question I'll ask if people want to respond or give a comment. So I'm going to go through these questions somewhat quickly, and then we'll come back, like I said. And then after that, we'll kind of go through some scriptures that will hopefully address those questions. And again, I would really like a lot of interaction, whatever you want to in terms of stepping in. First question, and these are questions primarily regarding ancient Israel. How many covenants did Jehovah make with ancient Israel from the time they left Egypt until they went into the promised land? Okay. Number two, where was Jehovah's covenant with ancient Israel made? Number three, what animal or animals was or were sacrificed when Jehovah's covenant with ancient Israel was made? Number four, where was the covenant Jehovah made with ancient Israel placed? Number five, when Jehovah made the covenant with ancient Israel, on who or what was blood sprinkled? Number six, we know that the Levites, specifically the sons of Aaron, became the priests of Israel after the golden calf incident. Who were the priests of Israel before that? Number seven, we know that the Levites, specifically the sons of Aaron, became the priests of Israel after the golden calf incident, and tithes and offerings were overseen by them. Who did the Israelites give their tithes and offerings to before that? Number eight, under the Eternal's covenant with Israel, who was allowed to build altars and make sacrifices? So that's my 8 questions. I'm coming back now to number 1, and this is the beginning of the interactive portion of our program. How many covenants did Jehovah make with ancient Israel from the time they left Egypt until they went into the promised land? Anybody?
Is this a trick question?
They're all a trick question.
I thought so.
Sort of, kind of, not meant to be tricked, meant to be thought-provoking.
I'll say just one.
One. We've got one from Alan. Anybody else? Don't be afraid.
The phones are going to have to mute, or I'm going to end up muting them because they're causing severe echo. And just star key will mute your phone.
Nobody else wants to venture a guess. Huh? Okay.
Peggy said 7.
7. Wow. That. Now.
Kurt Berry through the chat room says 8 or 9.
8 or 9. Okay. I'm good.
There is covenant with Noah.
Okay. Well, I'm talking from the time Israel left Egypt until they went into the promised land.
Oh, okay. In that frame of time.
Okay. We're going to move on then. Next question.
You didn't get answered, did you?
We're going to answer. I'm just going back through now. Okay. Where was Jehovah's covenant with ancient Israel made? Anybody?
Horeb, Sinai?
Mount Sinai? Okay. If there was just one, I guess that's the right answer.
I think it was made it at the tabernacle.
At the tabernacle. Okay. Anybody else want to venture a guess? All right. We're going to move on. I think. Number 3. What animal or animals were sacrificed when Jehovah's covenant with ancient Israel was made?
Sorry, I had my mic muted on the last question.
Oh,
I was going to say one covenant was made with Abraham when he split the animals in two.
okay. But my question is with ancient Israel.
Well, that's real ancient. Where they were. Oh, well.
Okay.
That
All
was
right.
my thought.
No, that's a problem. No problem. Okay. And I'm not, we'll wait for this one because we'll move. Number 4. Where was the covenant Jehovah made with ancient Israel placed? So after the covenant was made, what happened to it? Where was it placed?
Ark of the Covenant.
In the Ark of the Covenant? Okay.
Yeah, that's what we were saying here. Some of us, anyways.
Okay. And when Jehovah made covenant with ancient Israel, on who and or what was the blood sprinkled?
I think it was sprinkled on all the articles of the tabernacle, on the book of the law, and on the people.
Okay. Wow, he's covering all of his bases there. I like that. Anybody else? Any thoughts? All right. Number 6, we know that the Levites, specifically the sons of Aaron, became the priests of Israel after the golden calf incident. Who were the priests of Israel before that?
What? Yeah, theater.
No, we only really hear the word priest used a couple times, I think, from Melchizedek.
No, the Bible says that answer specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a firstborn in Exodus 13.
Okay.
Oh, I thought he was talking about after the covenant of Sinai.
No,
Okay.
no.
After the golden calf incident. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said after the golden calf incident, we know it was Aaron. Who were the priests of Israel before that?
The firstborn.
Okay, we got the firstborn.
Yeah, because it says in Exodus, well, there's a number of places, but in Numbers, let's see if I got the right scripture up here. Numbers 3, verse 12. It says specifically that the Levites replaced the firstborn.
Right. And that's when Israel had to redeem the firstborn after that. So
Yeah, so the Levites, that's a one-on-one transaction. So the firstborn were the priests. So like Jethro was a priest of Midian, and Midian was a descendant from Abraham. And so there is a lot that says it, but there were priests for each family. And so the firstborn
Okay.
had that responsibility traditionally.
All right.
That seems a little odd because we don't see the firstborn son of Jacob being referred to as priest.
Oh yeah, that was the big stink, you know. There was the firstborn. See, it doesn't say it a lot explicitly, but if you backtrack and look, well, the firstborn is always mentioned, and then the mantle of the firstborn was transferred,
Right.
and so
So you have the
first-
incident there with Reuben because he gave up his status, then that was transferred to somebody else.
Yes, so it doesn't go into a pedantic explanation about how the firstborn, what all their responsibilities are as the priest of their clan, but they definitely had a pecking order in the clans, and each had a role in the council, and and so if you go back, backtrack, well, then you can see the pattern going all the way back to the beginning.
That's kind of strange because the firstborn son was to inherit twice as much as the other sons, and the Levite had no inheritance. Kind of like a little bit of an oxymoron there.
Could it be the head of household?
Well, that might kind of correspond with the firstborn. Typically becomes kind of the head of the household.
Because the other problem would be is that your firstborn, how long, to the proper age that, if he's a priest at 1 year old or 2 year old, what kind of decisions can he make?
All right. All right, we're going to move on here. Number 7, similar question. We know that the Levites, specifically the sons of Aaron, became the priests after the golden calf incident, and tithes and offerings were overseen by them. Who did Israelites give their tithes and offerings to before that? All right, I'm going to go one more question here.
I think they did not, actually.
You didn't think? Okay. All right. Didn't want to cut anybody off there.
Yeah, Jim here. Yeah, they were to be a nation of priests, and as far as the tithes and stuff, Abraham gave a tithes to Melchizedek, but of all the things that he got out of the war that he was in, but he didn't give tithes of the land and stuff like that, like Israel was had to do after during this at the time of the coming out of Egypt and entering into that covenant with Jehovah there. So.
Right. All right. And we got one last question. Under the Eternal's covenant with Israel, who was allowed to build altars and make sacrifices?
I think anyone. Noah did. Abraham did.
Okay, I heard some folks there talking about Noah and Abraham, and what did that change though after the golden calf incident? When the Levites became the priests, did that change? So I kind of raised these up there to kind of these questions to get you to start thinking about some ideas. And we're going to try to now go through and answer some of those questions. And hopefully you'll see a theme here as we go to kind of get into this whole topic of the book of the covenant versus the book of the law. And I want to talk specifically that there was two covenants that Jehovah made with ancient Israel from the time they left out of Egypt until they entered into the promised land. And there was one made in Mount Sinai, or Horeb, and one at the land of Moab. In Deuteronomy 29, verse 1 is the scripture I want to start with there in that regard. It says, "These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah made with Moses, or commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab." So here we are in book of Deuteronomy. We're towards the end, actually, of the book of Deuteronomy. Not too long after this, of course, Moses is going to go up onto Mount Nebo and won't follow the children of Israel into the land. So it says here, "These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah made with Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb," or at Mount Sinai. So in my way of counting, if you have a covenant besides another covenant, that would make two covenants. I think we sometimes think that these are the same covenant. And while there are components that are the same, I'm going to talk to you that I think they're different. And we're going to see the differences as we kind of proceed. This is one Sinai covenant, and I'm going to propose to you that starts in the book of Exodus, beginning about chapter 19, verse 5. This is where he tells them to prepare themselves, wash themselves, and be ready. Gives them the 10 commandments. The people say, "Stop speaking to us, Moses. You go up," and he comes back and gives them the rest up through Exodus 24, verse 11. Then beginning in verse 12 through the book of Deuteronomy, I'm going to call the Moab covenant. And we'll talk about that as we go here a little bit. Again, please feel free to jump in if you've got questions or comments. The animals that were sacrificed and what was sprinkled in these two different covenants is actually different. In the Sinai covenant at Mount Sinai, we read about in Exodus 24, it says, verse 5, it says, "And he sent young men unto the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto Jehovah. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant, and he read it in the audience of the people. And they said, All that Jehovah said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant, which Jehovah made with you concerning all these words." So this is the initial covenant here. This is before the golden calf breach. This is where Jehovah then makes a covenant with Israel. And the people say, whatever you say, we will do. We will be obedient. And so we notice here that they sacrifice offerings. Specifically, it talks here that they sacrifice oxen. He took the blood, sprinkled it on the altar, and then on the people. Now that differs a little bit from the Moab covenant. And I have a reference here from Hebrews 9 where it talks about it. It says, "For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats, okay, with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, This is the blood of the testament which Elohim has enjoined unto you. Moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry." So this is the covenant he made at the time at Moab. before they went into the land. And you'll notice here it mentions that he sprinkles both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. Well, there wasn't a tabernacle at the time when he made this first Sinai covenant with ancient Israel. That doesn't actually get mentioned about the construction of the tabernacle and things until after Exodus 24, verse 11. So, as again, we see there's two different things going on here. Two different animals, different things are getting sprinkled with the blood. Two different things. Again, I think we commonly group these together, or lots of times, often, the book of Deuteronomy, for instance, is often saying it's just a restatement of the law or the restatement of the covenant. But they're very different in terms of what's done and what's offered and what's available at that point. Because like I mentioned, there's no tabernacle when the initial covenant's done at Mount Sinai. In fact, that hadn't even really been talked about yet. And it says, and they said, all that Jehovah said we will do and be obedient. The Moab covenant says, this is the blood of the testament which Elohim has enjoined unto you. So in the Sinai covenant, the people agree and we will do it and we will be obedient. The Moab covenant, though, it talks about him enjoining them this covenant. And if you look this up in the Greek there, you'll see, I'm not even going to try to butcher this, Entalohomi ahi, I guess, from Strong 1781. In the Greek, it means to order or to command to be done. And we pick up a little bit in Hebrews 9, again, about this in chapter 9, verses 8 through 10. It says, the Holy Ghost signifying that the way to the holiest was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure of the time come present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make them that did the service perfect as pertaining to conscience, which stood only in meats and drinks and diverse washings and cardinal ordinances imposed on them until the day of Reformation. So the covenant at Moab was enjoined upon them. It was imposed, in a sense, on them. And as we talked a little bit earlier, the firstborn had the significance, but after the golden calf incident, then the Levites took over a lot of those roles that the people were supposed to have. And that whole thing was imposed upon them, that whole concept.
Hey, John?
Yes.
Now, in Hebrews 9 there, how do we know that that was in Moab?
Well, because for one thing here, it's talking about the tabernacle. And again, the tabernacle wasn't even mentioned at Mount Sinai until after the golden calf incident.
Right, but the tabernacle was constructed before the 40-year wandering.
Yes, that's true. But
so
it was...
It could Hebrews 9 be referring to what took place immediately following the construction of the tabernacle so that it was consecrated for its use? Or am I way off with that?
Well, I don't know that you're way off, because it's interesting there in Exodus 24. If you read in Exodus 24, and we'll touch a little bit on this, you know, they enter into the covenant, he sprinkles them with the blood, and then remember what happens from them, and this is kind of a pattern, as you see in the Old Testament, of a covenant being made, and then there was a covenant meal given. If you remember, Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders went up onto Mount Sinai and had a meal with Jehovah that kind of solidified the whole covenant.
Yes.
Okay. It was So
After the immediate construction of the tabernacle, wasn't there a kind of celebratory? If you look at Numbers chapter 7, where it was erected in its completeness, then the tabernacle was filled with smoke. Could this Hebrews 9 be talking about that particular point in time rather than Moab? Because Moab's at the end of the 40 years.
it is, and as I mentioned, I think that the covenant after the golden calf incident, it's going to start building towards this second covenant. Now, there's things that we read in Exodus after Exodus 24. For instance, in Leviticus, it talks about the holy days. Well, the holy days were part of the original covenant. They're also mentioned later also. There are things that are mentioned after that were part of the original covenant at Mount Sinai. Are also carried forward throughout the rest of the 5 books. But what I'm trying to distinguish here is that there was, at the time that the covenant was made at Mount Sinai originally, there was no tabernacle yet. It hasn't even been discussed.
Right.
It was after that. And we're going to get to an important scripture coming up here.
Okay.
If you'll let me get to that, and then we'll talk about that some
If
more.
I stop interrupting you.
Oh, it's okay. Not a problem.
I just never had it in my mind that Hebrews 9 was at the end of the 40 years. That's all.
Yeah, the tabernacle and stuff was actually discussed and built, and it went through the wilderness. But again, it was after, a lot of it was after the whole golden calf incident, or just prior to it. It's mentioned before the golden calf incident, but they actually didn't start building it until afterwards. And so I guess there's another concept we got to think about, is that in our Western Greek mindset, we think everything's written in a chronological order, okay? But that's not how Hebrew goes. That's not how it's done. Just as for instance, if you remember, back in like Exodus 16, where they have the incident with the manna coming down, okay? And I forget if it's Exodus 16. It's right in there, right before they get to Mount Sinai. They have the whole incident with the manna falling, and they go out and pick it up and things. And it mentions there in Scripture that they took some of the manna and put it in a pot that was then put with the Ark of the Covenant, if you remember that. Well, none of that had even happened yet. So why are they mentioning that we're going to take some of this manna and put it in the pot? It's just a way of Hebrew thinking that they're tying this stuff together, even though it actually hasn't happened until in the future. Some of this, I think, is also because of the Torah portions and the way they are divided up, that they mention things like that. They're sort of kind of mentioned out of time sequence just to collect a thought. So anyways, that's we'll get to some more of the answers to that in a minute.
All right. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, and who were the priests? At the Sinai covenant, as was mentioned about firstborn, but specifically he says here in Exodus 19, he says, "Now therefore, if you will obey my voice, indeed keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all the people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel." So at the Sinai covenant, again, the whole nation was actually a kingdom of priests. The firstborn, I think, had preeminence in that. Even if you go back before that, as was mentioned, the head of the household, that was passed down. You got the whole storyline between Jacob and Esau, for instance, where he gives up his firstborn status, or was taken from him, depending on how you look at that. So up to this point, and at the time of the Sinai covenant, the people themselves, the nation of Israel, was supposed to be a kingdom priest and was supposed to represent Yehovah to the nations. But we know then after the golden calf incident, that was taken away from all of the people and was given to Aaron and his descendants, and they were made the priest, the Levitical priesthood. And they are what then became in effect at that point. Okay? All right. Again, in the Sinai covenant, they were supposed to all be priests. The whole nation was supposed to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. All right. Now, we know, and I'm going to go back a little bit here, and this is talking about, again, who were the priests prior to this. And we read in 2 Peter chapter 2:5, and it says, "Spare not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." Notice that that word person there and in King James is in italics. So if you take that out, it says, "But saved Noah, the eighth, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." Some of you who were at the feast in Michigan this last year, I spoke a little bit about this. And this has the whole idea of who were the priests, or the Melchizedek priests, I'll say specifically going back from the beginning. And it says here that Noah was the eighth preacher of righteousness. If you think about righteousness, is Zedek, right? It's where we get this concept of the Melchizedek. It's a king priest, or a king of righteousness. And I'm going to propose to you that Noah was the eighth, it says there, the eighth preacher of righteousness, but he was the 10th generation. So Adam was a Melchizedek priest. He was supposed to rule over the creation. That then was passed down to his son Seth, to Enos, to Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared. And I've got an asterisk next to Enoch here, because if you remember, Enoch was translated. So Jared actually outlived him, and so then the priesthood would have passed down to Methuselah. From Methuselah, he outlived Lamech, because Methuselah died right before the flood. Lamech died prior to that. So therefore, from Methuselah, then it goes to Noah. And of course, we see that from Noah, his son Shem would have been the next one. And I think, and a lot of Jewish writings will support this, that the Melchizedek that Abraham dealt with would have been Shem. Okay, he would have been the king priest that Abraham would have got. But again, this just has to do with this line of the priesthood coming through up until the time, as we get then up till the time before ancient Israel goes to Mount Sinai. What happens after that, we know that Shem would have been the next priest after Noah. From him, it would have likely gone to Eber or to Abraham, not sure which. Then to Isaac, to Jacob. Eventually it goes to Joseph, because again, Reuben defiled his father's bed, so his firstborn status was taken. And again, eventually, and we're going to look at some concepts here, I'm going to propose to you that it then eventually gets to Moses, actually. want you to think about the concept that in Exodus 3, when Elohim calls Moshe to go and get his, they're at Mount Sinai, he comes before the burning bush, and Jehovah calls him to go to get his people out of ancient Israel. And in a concept, he's kind of making him a priest. He's sending him for his people. He's going to be the leader. He's going to be, in a sense, the king priest. It's going to get them. Again, we've already read in Exodus 19, verse 3 through 6, that the whole house of Jacob, all of Israel, were supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And then what happens after the golden calf incident? If you remember, Jehovah says to Moses, says, these are your people that you brought out of Israel. And he basically wanted to wipe them all out and start over with Moses. And Moses intercedes and says, no, don't do that. And so he relents. So Moshe was acting in that intercessory role and basically keeps ancient Israel from being completely wiped out. But as part of that, the golden calf incident, then he puts in place the whole Levitical priesthood. So there's some other thoughts just to think about. If you watch the Ten Commandments movie, where does Moses get his rod from? The staff that he has that's then used to do the miracles and those types of things? Well, in Cecil B. DeMille's great story, he gets that it was a rod that Moses was tied to, and then it's handed to him as he goes be sent out into the desert. But if you read that concept of the whole rod and follow that through, there are a couple of occasions it's called the rod of Moses, or sometimes the rod of Aaron, but it's also called the rod of God. And so I think this was a special staff that was given to him. Again, that's something you could do some research on. If you look at some books like the Book of Jasher and different things, it becomes kind of interesting. And I think that Moses was kind of put into this Melchizedek status as kind of leader. But again, all of Israel was supposed to be a kingdom of priests as well.
Oh, John,
Yes.
we got questions and things scrolling in the chat room. You might want to open that up and
Oh, okay. Let me see here.
bottom center of the window.
Okay.
I don't know if you could. Oh, wait, maybe with the PowerPoint you can't see it.
Okay. Well, I can get out of that, I suppose. Okay. I got it.
Oh, you got it. Good.
I think so. How do we know that Methuselah died right before the flood? I've never found proof either way of that. Well, I don't know how quickly before the flood, but obviously he wasn't on the ark. So he had to die before the flood. I don't know how right before the flood it was. And so that would be kind of my quicker answer to that. The next question, how do you handle Hebrews 7:1-3, where the Melchizedek was not father or mother or genealogy? If you do some research on that, and that would take a whole nother topic. If you do some looking at that, it has to do, and one good source I found for this is actually the Aramaic New Testament. Got some interesting discussion about that and the terminology that's used, but it kind of gets a reference to that the Melchizedek priesthood was not like the Levitical priesthood, where that was very much tracked, mothers, fathers, who was in descent and all of that. Because we know in the Melchizedek line, I mean, it did pass down from Adam all the way down, but then we get to situations like I mentioned with Jacob and Esau, with Reuben, that it then passes down to Joseph. So while it's talking about mothers and fathers, it has more to do with the ancestral line as far as the Levitical priesthood, and it's making a comparison there. And James has got a comment here next that about the verse about Melchizedek is simply saying it doesn't matter what his lineage was, but he was still a priest. Not that we have no idea who his mother and father were. And that's correct. So, and then I think Kurt's talking here. It says in verse 3, it says he was a priest for all time. Shem died. Well, where it's talking about, I think, the priest for all time, the Melchizedek priest is obviously Messiah, and he is the priest for all time, a Melchizedek priest for all time going forward. But he was of the order of Melchizedek, so that would talk about that there would have been others in that. And if you take a look at the word there, the order of in the Greek there, or even in the Hebrew, you can take a look at it. It talks about the concept of an order or a line. And so where it's talking about that he was a priest for all time, I think that concept has to do with that eventually Messiah was a priest for all, going forward, would be the Melchizedek priest going forward. I wanted to throw these ideas out just to kind of give you some idea about what we do know from Exodus 19 is that all Israel was supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And this is different than what happens later than once the Levites take over. All of Israel no longer is in that role of priesthood. Okay. Again, kind of referring to Yeshua, Hebrews 6, it says, whether the forerunner is for us entered, even Yeshua made a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So he is of this order of Melchizedek, and I know that at least my background coming up from Worldwide and things talked about this Melchizedek being a pre-incarnate Christ. But again, if you do some research in some of the Jewish writings and things, not that I think that everything they have is right either, there seems to be a lot of idea that this idea of the priesthood was passed down from Adam on through. And again, we got to remember that Melchizedek or Melchizedek is not a name, it's a title. And it tells us that it means Melchi has to do with king, Zedek has to do with righteousness, king of righteousness. And so it's this idea of king of righteousness. And if you think about it, Solomon was king and also was called king of righteousness. Not that he was a Melchizedek priest in that sense, but that terminology is used. Again, it's a title, not a name per se. Let's see. And again, I'd say for us, we read in Revelation 1 verse 6 and in 5 verse 10 that we are to be kings and priests, or a kingdom of priests, and we to the Heavenly Father. What priesthood are we? If we're going to be priests, obviously under the Messiah, and kingdom of priests or kings and priests, of what priesthood would we be a part of? Would we be part of the Levitical priesthood? Or would we be part under the Messiah as part of a Melchizedek priesthood? So again, these are just some ideas I wanted to throw out there. Kind of a little bit getting off track here, but I wanted to kind of talk to you about those things. Going back to our questions, where was the covenant of Yehovah made with angels in Israel placed? And we had some answers to that earlier, but I'm going to go in. It's just a reference. I think somebody had mentioned inside the ark. There's a reference to that in 1 Kings 8:9. It says there was nothing in the ark except the two stone tables Moses had placed in at Horeb, or at Mount Sinai, the tablets of the covenant which Yehovah made with ancient Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. So my little picture here, you'll see you've got the tables of stone, or the covenant per se. And actually, as we read in Exodus, there's a reference to the book of the covenant, but then there's also the tables given. So those were placed inside the ark. The ark was called the Ark of the Covenant. So that's where the covenant went, was inside. But then in Deuteronomy, we read about that it says, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the ark of the covenant, Yehovah your Elohim, that it may be there for a witness against you. So I had found this picture online. So the covenant was inside the ark of the covenant, but the book of the law that was given in Deuteronomy was placed outside the ark, and it was there as a witness against them. Okay, so two different things. And I think, again, most of us, I think, feel like that what happened in Deuteronomy later was just a restatement or a reissuing of the first covenant after it was broke. But it's two different things. There's two different things going on here. Hebrews 7 says, if therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest who should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? And I brought this scripture out because if you think about at Mount Sinai, when the covenant was given at Mount Sinai, there was no Levitical priesthood at that point. So the people did not receive the law, that law, under a Levitical priesthood. They agreed to that with Yehovah themselves. There was no Levitical priesthood at that point. So this has got to be talking about a separate thing, something different than that, the covenant that was later given at Moab. Galatians 3:15, and this is one of the scriptures I was talking about earlier, says, brethren, I speak after the manner of men, though it be a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannuls or adds thereto. So if you think about the covenant that's made at Mount Sinai, and Moses writes the book of the covenant, and the sacrifice is given, and there's blood sprinkled on the people, and then after that, the elders of Israel and them go up and have the covenant meal with Yehovah. This covenant is then sealed. No man can disannul it, or you can't add to it. So everything we read throughout the rest of Torah is now leading towards the second covenant, because you can't have a covenant that's sealed, that's blood ratified. We've got the meal that's given, and they enter into it, but then it's violated because of the golden calf incident. We can't then go on and add something to it. This then becomes a separate kind of covenant. You can't add to a covenant that's already ratified. So something else has to be going on here. We got some comments here. All right, so James, I don't know if everybody's seeing this. James says, the covenant was the 10 commandments written on the front and back of the tablet, 2 copies, but God did not need his copy of the contract. Where in Deuteronomy 31 says that this was extended to be read in the tabernacle every 7 years. And it talks about that this was a suzerain covenant between the king and his servants. I would agree that the Deuteronomy covenant, the Moab covenant, that's true. The covenant that was made at Sinai, however, was basically the extension of what Jehovah had entered into with Abraham, starting first in Genesis 12, where he says, I swear with an oath, because I can swear with no greater, that he will bless Abraham. And then that's extended in Genesis 15, where Abraham kind of comes back and says, how will I know that you'll do this thing? You know, how will I know that my descendants are going to come? And so, in the sense that Abraham has some doubt here, so he's asking for Jehovah to give him some surety. And so this is then in Genesis 15 where we have the dividing of the animals and going on. But what happens then, and this continued on till we get to Mount Sinai, is basically he's extending this same covenant to Abraham's descendants, and that they would become part of that. Abraham knew nothing about a Levitical priesthood. He knew nothing about any of those things, about a tabernacle, about any of that kind of thing, because none of that had even been discussed. Okay. In Galatians 3:19, wherefore then serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promises was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. But if you think about this, where therefore serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions. Well, what was added because of transgressions? What transgression are we talking about? Well, we're talking here about the golden calf incident. Because prior to that, all of Israel accepted the covenant at Mount Sinai and accepted it and said we would agree. And so he entered into the covenant with them. But then after the golden calf incident, there was a law that was added because of the transgression. And we're talking here about the Levitical priesthood and a lot of the other things that were added throughout the rest of Torah. Now, again, there are parts to the rest of Torah that contain elements of the original covenant, but then there was several other new things that were added. And the law is not of faith, this is Galatians 3:12, but the man that does them shall live in them. Well, if we go back to Exodus 19 and Exodus 24, it says, the children of Israel answered, all that Jehovah has spoken we will do, and they accepted the book of the covenant, the law, in faith. So Galatians 3:12 can't be referring to the book of the covenant, but a separate law that is not of faith. Okay, they're saying, yes, we will do this. They accept the faith. We'll follow you. We'll do what you have asked us to do. And they accepted that in faith. So when it talks then in Galatians 3:12 that the law is not of faith, it can't be talking about this, because obviously that's what they accepted. They were accepting on faith that he would bless them and that they would follow and be his people up until the golden calf incident. In Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 8. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come and not a very image of things, could never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continue to make the comers thereunto perfect. For then they would have not ceased to offer, because that the worshippers, once purged, should have had no more conscience of sin. But in those sacrifices there is a remembrance again made of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Wherefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering thou wast not, but body hast thou prepared. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou had no pleasure. Then said I, lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O Elohim. Above, when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings, and offering for sin thou was not, neither had he pleasure in them, which were offered by the law. Well, again, these offerings for sins and sacrifices and all that all became effect under the Levitical priesthood. None of this stuff was listed back at Mount Sinai when the Book of the Covenant and the original covenant was given. These things were not listed until later. So again, it's talking about something separate. Deuteronomy 28:15 says, it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of Jehovah Elohim, to observe all the commands and his statutes which I command you this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Again, in Deuteronomy 29:21, it says, Jehovah shall separate him unto evil out of the tribe of Israel, according to all the curses of the covenant which are written in this book of the law. What covenant are we talking about here? Are we talking about the covenant at Mount Sinai? Or are we talking later here about the covenant at Moab? Because if you go back and read from Exodus 19 through 24, and the covenant that was given there with all of the things that are listed, there's only one curse that's even talked about in that covenant, and it had to do with a curse upon those who didn't honor their mother and father. It's just kind of the one thing that's given. The rest of these curses that it's being talked about here in Deuteronomy were later, after the golden calf incident, in the book of Deuteronomy, where he lists all of the blessings and the cursings and all of those things. That was given later, not as part of the covenant that was given at Mount Sinai. And again, from what we read there in Galatians, you can't add to a covenant once it's been ratified. So this has to be talking about something different. Exodus 20:22 through 26. And it says, Jehovah said unto Moses, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, we have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make with me gods of silver, neither unto gold. An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereupon thy burnt offerings, thy peace offerings, thy sheep, thine oxen, and all the places where I record my name. I will come unto you, and I will bless thee. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, shall build it of hewn stone. For if you lift up a tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shall you go up the steps unto my altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered thereon. So this is the question I had about who can build altars and who can give sacrifices. People, all of Israelites could do that, and he gives them instructions to do that. But what happens later then, after the golden calf incident? It's then only the Levitical priests who are doing the sacrificing. And as far as actually making altars, it says then he will, he talks about the time when that they'll come into the land and that he'll have a place where he'll place his name. And then that's where they'll come up to give their offerings and sacrifices. So before that, under the original covenant, people could go and make altars and give sacrifices. It didn't have to be done through this priesthood. But then after that, it did have to be done through the priesthood. So again, differences to the two concepts, to the two ideas going on here. And I would just kind of add to this, it's interesting that in the original Passover, who killed the sheep and who put it on their doorpost? Each of the heads of the households did that, right? But then later, we see that under the Levitical priesthood, you had to take your lamb up to the priest, and they killed them, and then you brought it back and ate at your home. And so, again, these concepts, they're different in that things have changed now because they're no longer the priesthood, they're no longer serving in that function, but that function's now being taken over by the Levites. There's a veil there for both Christians and Jews until their hearts are turned to Jehovah's covenants of promise. It's interesting that there's a scripture there in Galatians, I think it is, that talks about the covenants of promise, covenants plural, and to follow the teachings and instructions of Torah, the covenants of promise. And these go back to the covenant made with Abraham in Genesis 12, then in Genesis 15, then with ancient Israel at Mount Sinai. And so what is Messiah restoring in what is called a new covenant? He's restoring that ancient covenant from Mount Sinai that goes back to Abraham. Obviously, it's not just restoring it because he's making it better. He's adding to it better promises, those things. But it's this covenant of promise. The Levitical Moab covenant was something that was put in place because of their sin. Ephesians 2:14, Yeshua is our peace. He has made both one and broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the book of the law of commandments contained in ordinances. It's not a covenant. So as to create himself one new man from the two, making shalom. So again, we have this covenant that was made, but they violated. So then he puts in place the Levitical priesthood and these concepts, these laws, and those things that are put in place. And then Messiah comes to take us back to, or restore, or as we read in different places, until the restitution of all things. Well, what's being restored? He's trying to restore, or he came to restore us back to this covenant of promise, this concept that goes clear back to the time of, with Abraham and even before that, where we have this relationship one-on-one with Jehovah. We don't have a priesthood, a Levitical priesthood that's interceding in between. So he came to break that down, to restore us back to that covenant relationship that was lost because of the golden calf incident. The Jewish veil of confusion in reading the Old Testament is that most Jews understand that the law of Moses preserved their lives of ancient Israel because of the violation of the golden calf incident. Because they violated the covenant, then the law of Moses was put in place. It actually was what was to preserve them until Messiah comes. Most Jews don't fully recognize that the law of Moses, which is the book of the law, the Moab covenant, was to remain in administration only until the death penalty position could be paid. This goes back again to Genesis 15, the dividing of the animals. Basically said if either party violated the covenant, then this is what would happen to you. Well, ancient Israel did violate it. And what happened? Messiah had to come to pay that penalty. And I got a reference here to Genesis 49:10. It says, where it talks about until Shiloh comes. Okay, this is until the Messiah comes. That then he then can restore and put things back in order, put things back right. The Christians have this veil of confusion in reading that the Old Testament is that most Christians know that the law of Moses was abolished. And they don't understand that the law of Moses was a distinct law enactment, not the whole of the Old Testament law. Let's see here if we're getting comments.
Okay, you open.
Hello, John, this is Mike again.
Yes.
Okay, would you say that the covenant in Numbers 18, verse 19 is the same as the one in Deuteronomy at Moab?
I'm gonna pull up. Sorry, I don't have numbers memorized. Let me look here. Numbers 18.
Verse 19?
Talking about the salt covenant.
Yes, with Levi, the Levites.
So it's part of this offerings that were given at the temple had to be accompanied by salt. So it's part of the offerings given by the Levites. So I would say, I guess that's probably the case, yes. But the salt covenant concept is almost a little bit distinct from that. Although there was salt covenants given, salt was required at the temple as far as being offered with any kind of sacrifices that were given.
But part of the Levitical covenant.
It is. I would say that is part of the Levitical covenant, but where there's salt covenants outside of that,
Yeah.
there
Then-
may have been.
Numbers 25, verse 11, I think is directly referring to the covenant in Moab after the incident with the young ladies from Moab.
Okay.
Again, restating the same basic thing that is in Deuteronomy, but in different context.
Right. I think, basically if you pick up starting from about Exodus 24, beginning of verse 12 on, all of that is leading up towards the Moab covenant. It's the things that were being added after the Sinai covenant. Because
Right.
again, because as we read there in Galatians, you can't, once you've ratified a covenant, you can't start adding things to it. So that has to now become part of something different. So pretty much everything you read from after Exodus 24, starting maybe verse 12 or so, that all starts leading towards this other covenant. Now, again, are there things from the original covenant in there? Yeah, we've got about the holy days. It talks about the Sabbath, gives us some more explanations about those things. That's all true. Those were part of it. But it's the Levitical priesthood, those other additional things that were added that become part of this separate or added to covenant that was put in place basically because of Israel's sin with the golden calf, but put in place to hold ancient Israel from being destroyed. It gave them a way to not be destroyed and to basically keep them in place until Messiah would come to be able to restore things back and put things back the right way.
Yeah, Numbers 25:11, it says that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, has deflected my wrath from the Israelites, he being the only one of them to have the same zeal as I have, for which reason I did not make an end of the Israelites in my zeal, which is very similar to the golden calf incident, the incident of the maidens of Moab, Balaam's suggestion to Balak that he send the pretty girls in.
Right.
And so I think this is the same one referenced in Deuteronomy, the exact same incident where the priesthood of Aaron is given a perpetual covenant to be the priesthood. And then, if we look at the 600 plus mitzvot, there's over 200 plus that refers specifically to the duties of the priesthood and the Levites. And, at least 1/3 of all the mitzvah or the mitzvot refer, here, which would be the law that was given because of the transgressions.
Right. It's one of the things I want to make sure that everybody understands. I'm not speaking against the second covenant, the book of the law, because we know in Timothy that all scripture is given to us for our benefit, for reproof, for doctrine. And so the idea of the Levitical priesthood gives us concepts about what Messiah does for us, right? I mean, this priesthood of interceding for us, being there. So there's things that we can learn from that. Just the same as, the sacrifices, the temple service. There's things for us to learn there. Obviously, we are now supposed to become the temple. And so are there things that we can learn from that? It's given to us. But we have to understand, though, why that was put in place was because of the golden calf incident. And so that Yehovah didn't just wipe them all out, Moses intercedes. And so this is what he put in place to keep ancient Israel in line, basically until we get to the point where Messiah could come and pay the penalty under the Genesis 15, the dividing of the animals, and then restore ancient Israel, then restore Israel back to the covenant relationship that they had before the golden calf incident. And obviously even made it better because he's now a Melchizedek priest that doesn't die, none of that happens. He's now for all time. And so he brings back the idea of the covenant of promise, this covenant of faith that goes clear back to Abraham So that we got to think about that this book of the law, the Levitical priesthood, all of that had a purpose, and that there's certainly things that we can learn from it, to know about. Certainly those are things that, they're important. Just another, I'm thinking about this is, all of the Israelites and anybody who joined with them at the first Passover had to be circumcised, right? And that was the sign, the principal sign of being in covenant given at the time of Abraham. Then after the golden calf incident, and they're wandering through the desert for 40 years, their children weren't circumcised anymore. It wasn't until you get right before they're getting ready to enter back into the promised land that Joshua then has all of those that had been born or was below the age 20 till that generation had died off. Then they all had to be circumcised again to enter into the land. Well, why weren't they circumcising folks during their wandering? Well, at that point, they had broken the covenant. They were no longer in covenant. So that sign of the covenant was no longer in place. Now, he reinstitutes it apparently as they're getting ready to enter into the land, into the promised land, the land that that was promised to Abraham. And so he does then reinstitute the circumcision at that point. But it's under the Levitical law and things like that. They had broken the covenant, therefore they weren't circumcising anymore, is at least one thought. I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts on that.
I don't really see how that could be, John, because they were still being held to the 10 Commandments during the 40 years, which was part of the Sinai covenant. So if we say circumcision was not happening because they were out of covenant, were they still being held to the standard of the 10 words?
Well, you have to remember that the original covenant was more than just the 10 Commandments. I think Jim wrote that also about being on the 2 tablets. The 10 Commandments were written on the 2 tablets of stone, but there was a mention there in Exodus 24, the book of the covenant. And so it would contain not just the 10 Commandments, but all those other things that we read about in Exodus 21, 22, 23 up through the beginning of 24. There was other things there as well. But your point about they were still under the 10 Commandments, they had violated that covenant, which contained the 10 Commandments, I agree. And then as they were brought back in under the Levitical priesthood, that was still part of it. Keeping the Sabbath was still part of it. Those things were still part of it. But the covenant with Abraham had been violated. Until that got restored, which wouldn't happen until Messiah would come. I mean, there's a thought there that, and obviously Jews still circumcised, and they did once they got into the land, but it's just, there was a period there for 40 years they weren't circumcising, and why was that?
I don't know. I guess I never really thought about were they circumcising when they were in Egypt? And is that why they were told to circumcise for the Passover's sake? I don't know what they did for 400 years in Egypt. Towards the end of it, I'm sure there were many who were being amalgamated into Egyptian culture and probably were not very aware of what Abraham had done other than through some kind of oral tradition.
Right, right.
But obviously, like you said, they were still in use of the Levitical priesthood for the whole 40 years. And the manna still fell for 40 years, and on the Sabbath, no manna. So we know that that part of the covenant was still in effect for the 40.
Right. I mean, again, there was, during that 40 years, the holy days and things, the Sabbath, a lot of the concepts and things were still being carried forward. But then we have all this, the other stuff with the Levitical priesthood and those things that was put into place, again, as a way to hold ancient Israel until the time would come when Messiah could return and restore them back to this covenant of promise.
Okay, so let me try to clarify something. The tabernacle was constructed starting in approximately Exodus 25. They gathered the materials. And the tabernacle was constructed early in the 40-year period, probably in the third year. Would you guess?
Yeah, some on there.
Okay, so the priesthood was operating, those who were assigned to move the tabernacle and all the rest. But then you're saying the sprinkling of the blood on the book of the law didn't happen until Moab, which is at the end of the 40 years.
Towards the end, yes.
Okay, so that's the part I was confused with. I always had a picture in my mind that the sprinkling of the blood on the book of the law and on the altar and on the rest of it was when the tabernacle was first constructed. I didn't think of it as being much later. So that's where I was getting kind of confused with it.
In Exodus 29, verse 9,
Hang on, let me see what, okay, you're on.
are we on?
Yeah. Right.
Okay, in Exodus 29, verse 9, the establishing of the Levites and the children of Aaron as a priesthood, it becomes a law. And the type of law it is, the New Testament doesn't break down the types of laws, but it's a statute, a kukah. It's a perpetual statute. And so it's a specific type of a statute which is perpetual, and it was established in Exodus 29. And so the office of the Levitical priesthood and the covenant, made with them was made in Exodus 29, and then it's perpetual as a statute, which there's many different types of laws. The mitzvot is the broad term for commandment, but then you have the ordinances, the statutes, and all the different types of laws. So the legal aspects of this are all outlined, and then like it says in Hebrews, the legality. It was not a moral law. It was a statute, which would be a national law, for the governing of the nation. And so it's all really well laid out legally. And I agree that it was after their falling, they said they would, the Sinaitic covenant, and then obviously they didn't. And so the law of the priesthood was established because of their transgressions, and then it was reconfirmed with in Moab with the incident where they, it's like the golden calf, where they were, had mass fornication, and then Phineas actually saved the nation by going and killing the fornicators, by putting a sword through them. And so it was more or less reestablished in Moab, what was established in Exodus 29, verse 9, that it was a perpetual statute to consecrate Aaron and his sons, and that's actually, the law that was added because of transgression refers to the physical works of doing all the sacrifices, which were only a foreshadowing of the spiritual sacrifice.
Right, but we have to also recognize that there were sacrifices before all that. I mean,
Yeah.
Obviously,
Yes.
Noah gave sacrifices, Abraham gave sacrifices, people gave sacrifices, and there were other reasons. But then under the Levitical priests, there were some very specific things that were commanded for them to do.
Yes.
The morning and evening sacrifices, those types of things were given and added.
Perpetual statute.
Yeah.
Which,
So we talked here also in the book of Hebrews that why was there a new law needed or a change in the law needed when Messiah came? Because now he's under a Melchizedek priesthood, no longer under the Levitical priesthood. And once the temple went away, there was no Levitical priesthood. That didn't happen anymore. I mean,
exactly right. It was an administrative statute.
right.
Yes, that's a proper place for the Levitical laws, as an administrative statute for the nation of Israel.
There's additional comments in the chat room. I don't know if you finished Jim Rudd's comments or not. No, you started on it and he added as you were talking.
Oh. I got down. Okay, then it goes down the curse. Says Hebrews 3 seems to address the rebellion of the people coming out of Egypt. Torah was still in place, but people were not obeying it, lest they did not enter into the promised land. I mean, the idea that that original generation didn't enter into the land was part of their penalty for the golden calf incident, that they were not going to be allowed to go in. I mean, it can, I guess it actually came because of their refusal to go into the land, and then they had to wander for 40 more years, but they still continued just to rebel. And they always continued to rebel all the way up. Obviously, when you read there in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where he talks about the blessings and the cursings, that he says basically they're still gonna violate this, and he's gonna send them into dispersion into all the nations of the earth. And that's part of the penalty. And so they did get dispersed. As we know, first the northern kingdom went with the Assyrians, then the southern kingdom went to Babylon. They did come back, but then were eventually dispersed after the Romans, although they did keep their identity. But that was the penalty, because but he told them ahead of time, even under Moses, that this was going to happen. But then that's why we read that when Messiah came and called the disciples, calls them fishers of men, which is a direct reference to Deuteronomy 16. I'm sorry, not Deuteronomy, Jeremiah 16, where it talks about that he would send fishers for them and bring them back. So as we read at the end time, then he's going to bring back all of Israel back to the land and restore them. He's going to bring them back to these covenants of promises, bring them back to the position that they should have had if they had kept the original covenant at Mount Sinai, which is an extension of what was offered to Abraham. They were Abraham's descendants. They were in his covenant, but they violated that. So all this time they've been out of that with this placeholder of the Levitical priesthood until Messiah could come and start bringing them back under that covenant of promise. Okay.
Question I have, I think this was a parting message from Jim before he left. I don't think you got it. What is your thoughts on 1 Chronicles 35, verse 14 and verse 30? Apparently they refer to both of these things being the same covenant.
1 Chronicles
35.
We got to get there first.
Yeah.
Is this where they find the?
I don't know. He was saying this was a private message. He's not agreeing with you, and he left. But he did leave these scriptures to look at.
So it must be 2 Chronicles 35, because there's no 1 Chronicles 35.
Okay.
And what was the scripture?
Verse 14, it calls the book of the covenant, and in verse 30, it's called the book of the law. Both refer to the books of Moses. Is his point.
I'm not seeing where he's at, because that's not what it says there, but there was the incident where was the king that found the.
It's in chapter 34.
Oh, that where I'm off the chapter there. 2 Chronicles 34. And what verse do you know?
Verse 14 is one of them, where they found the book of the law.
And they brought out the money and the priests. They found the book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Okay.
And in his comment, he says, and it was referred to again in verse 30, where it's called the Book of the Law and Moses.
Okay. Well, there was a book of the law, and there was also the book of the covenant. The book of the law, as we showed, was placed outside of the ark.
Both referred to as the Book of Moses. Oh, well, I'm just presenting what he said.
Because in verse 30, it's referred to as the Book of the Covenant.
Right. But again, two covenants, right? Or, it's called the book of the law. The second Moab covenant, it's called the book of the law, but it's also referred to as a covenant. So I think it can be both. But there's certainly a distinction, because the covenant that was at Mount Sinai was placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, where the Moab covenant, or the book of the law, or the law of Moses, was placed outside of the Ark, inside.
The big problem we have with reading, through the Greek New Testament is by not having the specific word, so law is equal, to us, but the book of the Torah is what was found here. Torah would be the first 5 books, of Moses. So this would be the Torah scroll.
That's right. Yes, that's a possibility. Yeah, and so it would have both.
Torah is the 5 books. That's the scroll, and that's what's read. Every in the synagogue you have your parashah. Then at the 8th day of the after the Feast of Tabernacles, it's all rolled back up and they start over again.
Right.
So Torah basically means instructions. That's the overarching, broad, general term. But then you have different types of you have statutes, you have judgments, you have ordinances, which each is a different. And so the idea of, when it was established that the Levites would replace the firstborn as the priesthood, that was hukah, a statute. In other words, that was an administrative national statute that was made, establishing them, within the nation of Israel as the priests, which in Hebrews it says that was an administrative change, and because it was an administrative change with, a precedent before that, all you have to do is go back to the precedent of the statute. It's just like in our legal system. Every law has a precedent. And so since the Melchizedek priesthood preceded the Levitical one, and the Levitical one was a hukah, a specific type of a statute, that statute was liable to its precedent, returning back to its precedent.
Right.
And so being established as, we saw in Numbers chapter 3 and Exodus 29 verse 9, that was immediately right after their, like you say, the golden calf incident, right at the very beginning of the building of the tabernacle. And then what you have in Moab was a reaffirmation that because Phineas was so zealous, he was the high priest, the son of the high priest, that covenant was reestablished there at Moab, but it's the same one that's in, it did not begin at Moab. It was reconfirmed that because Phineas was so zealous, Otherwise, you know, the nation of Israel would have been destroyed, just like when Moses interceded and intervened, you know, for the nation of Israel with the golden calf incident. It was the exact same thing that Phineas did as what Moses did. So that established the leadership of the sons of Aaron as being the ones zealous to hold the nation of Israel on a track.
Right. And it's interesting there where it says to Phineas is that because he did this, he would be given the covenant of peace. And he was the only one given that. And so, of course, we know that's a precursor leading, we're looking forward to the Messiah coming.
Exactly.
Given the covenant of peace. So
it's a little bit how you parse it, because, you know, you have in Exodus 31, you have the perpetual covenant of Shabbat for Israel. You know, you have the, within the priesthood, you have the covenant of salt. Well, you know, are those subsets or are those synonyms? You know, it depends how you parse it out, but we definitely have a separate covenant, administrative covenant for the nation of Israel when they're put underneath the guidance of the priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, as opposed to being the precedent, you know, as the priesthood of the clans, you know, the firstborn and like you say, it was definitely an administrative change, which would revert to its precedent at a certain point in time.
right.
Yeah. I think Jim's point was that it was a reconfirming, but you're saying administrative change to reconfirm it.
Yeah, you know, it was underneath Torah is the whole chalupa.
Right, right. And Torah mentions the 10.
Right.
So in Torah is the 10, but the 10 were initially given and preserved inside
The ark.
the ark.
But the Torah scroll was outside the ark.
Right, where they could refer to the 10.
Yeah, and as well as, you know, the book of Leviticus was there, you know, the book of Numbers.
Right, and I think maybe that was what Jim was trying to say, that the two are intricately woven together, even though there was this administrative change.
Yeah,
to keep them on track.
One was a subset of another. So
Right.
Torah is the overarching, which is talking about in Second Chronicles, but the kuka of the, you know, the Baruchah, you know, of our own, that was a subset, administrative thing underneath the larger, you know, like you might say Torah would be like our Constitution in a sense, or the 10 Commandments would be like the Constitution as far as being an overarching law underneath which all the other statutes, ordinances, judgments, you know, because you got the Mishpokah, which are a separate category from the Kukah, which are, you know, they're all separate categories of administration. And each has a different legal way of handling, you know, like a judgment, of course, that would be based upon precedent also, just like it is in our legal system. So a judgment always has a precedent from which the judgment is made.
And the whole goal of the whole thing and the whole process is to return us to what we had in the beginning.
Well, you know, and what a lot of people don't realize is that almost all churches all hold on to at least 200 of the mitzvot. If you go right into their teachings, they will agree with over 200 of the 600 plus mitzvot. And then the other third would be specifically referring to temple service and Levitical priesthood. And so really our differences with mainstream Christianity boil down to a handful of, you know, the Sabbath, the holy days, and clean and unclean meats, you know, which they'll argue was, you know, a part of the administrative laws that only apply to Israel. And we would say, oh no, that's those are moral laws that apply to all mankind, and we can argue back and forth. But I mean, the difference is there's only a handful of differences between us and mainstream Christianity when it comes to mitzvot. In fact, the Mormons have 4,000 commandments you got to follow, and most New Covenant churches, they call themselves New Covenant churches, will point to over 1,000 commandments in the New Testament that are binding upon the church. So it's really only a handful of differences between us and the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that it gets, to me, an important concept is getting us back to the promises made to Abraham. These covenants of promises, that's where, that's obviously for us where we're trying to get to. That's what the Messiah was trying to bring us back to, because we even read there in Peter about how, again, this whole idea that we are supposed to be a peculiar people, holy people. Again, it's returning us to that status that they had at Mount Sinai. He's trying to get us back to that point, and that's why he had to come. He had to come to pay the penalty for the dividing of the animals there in Genesis 15, pays that penalty because of the covenant being broken. And now he's able to then restore us back to this original covenants, the covenants of promise that he gave with Abraham, even going back further.
With the 200 to 300 mitzvot found within the Levitical priesthood, those were the schoolmaster.
Right.
We could argue, well, were the seed part of the schoolmaster, or were they part of the moral law? And that's the whole thing, is we can look at the specific points, but the whole idea is that the Levitical system was added because of transgressions for a set period of time.
Right. I put up this scripture here in 1 Chronicles 16, and this is where they bring the ark and pitch the tabernacle at Jerusalem. And I think it's interesting because he's kind of referring back to Abraham and that. So then they brought the ark of Elohim and set it in the midst of the tent of David had pitched for it. And they offered burnt offerings, peace offerings before Elohim. And when David had made an end of the offering and the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Yehovah, and he dealt to every one of Israel, both man, woman, and every one a loaf of bread, a good piece of flesh, and a flagon of wine. And he appointed certain of the Levites to minister before the ark of Yehovah, and to record and to thank and praise Yehovah, the Elohim of Israel. Asaph, the chief, next to him Zechariah, Jeiel, Shimeroth, Jehiel, Mathitha, Elab, Benaiah, Obed Edom, and Jeiel, and psalteries and psalms, harps. Asaph he made the sound with cymbals. Verse 7 says, and on that day David delivered first the psalm to thank Yehovah into the hand of Asaph and his brethren. Give thanks to Yehovah, calling upon his name. Make known his deeds among the people. Sing unto him, sing psalms to him. Talk of his wondrous works. Glory ye in the holy name, his face continually. Remember his marvelous works that he hath done, his wonders and his judgments out of his mouth. O you seed of Abraham, his servant, you children of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is Yehovah or Elohim, his judgments are in all the earth. Be mindful always of his covenant, the words which he commanded to 1,000 generations, even of the covenant which he made with Abraham, and of his oath to Isaac, and he confirmed to Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant. So David knows and understands this is the everlasting covenant. This isn't the Levitical priesthood. This isn't the stuff that was added. This is harking back to the original promises given to Abraham, the original oath that was then extended to Isaac, to Jacob, and to all of Israel. at Mount Sinai until their violation of that with the golden calf incident. But David here understands and is bringing this to mind still, that they understood that this is where he was praising Yah because of these things he did to Abraham and to the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's all I had for this. Again, I wanted to just throw this out for people to think about. Like I mentioned, I've been looking at this for a long time, several months now, and just wanted to kind of put it out there, get you guys thinking about it. Hopefully can have you do a little research on your own if it interests you. And certainly open now if anybody's got any more comments or thoughts or questions. Or
There was one telephone I actually muted because it was a ton of noise coming off of it. I'm going to open that one back up. I don't know if they're going to kill the noise from the background, but sorry I had to mute you, but you were overriding everybody. I'm going to mute it now. Okay.
okay, anybody else with any thoughts?
Oh, I have one thought, which is a corollary.
Okay.
You mentioned about the Aramaic, and I thought of when you mentioned in Jeremiah 16 about going out to the 12 tribes of Israel. One thing I've been pointing out to people lately is that we think a lot, we know a lot about the Apostle Paul going to the Greeks, because it's a number of letters that he wrote and that were preserved. But we don't think about the 12 apostles that went out to the 12 tribes. You got a proportion of 12 to 1 there. And with Peter going to Babylon, I guess it's by tradition, but he had more congregations in Babylon of Jewish messianic believers than what we're all throughout Greece. That and then we know that the Apostle Thomas went as far as India. The Apostle Andrew went up to the shores of the Black Sea and into the Caucasus, and so we know where the 12 tribes of Israel were because the 12 apostles went to them, and so you have and then they all spoke Aramaic, which we have the Aramaic New Testament also, but there was more Aramaic speaking Israelites, you might say, back at that time, because just if you look at 12 apostles compared to one, I'm not sure that one apostle worked out over, did much, greater than 12 did. Combined.
Yeah, I would say also, even though with Paul, he went to, you mentioned to the Greeks and different people, we get this concept with the word of the Gentiles, but that really just means into the nations. And of course, where was ancient Israel scattered? They were scattered into the nations. So certainly a lot of the books, like in Ephesians and other places, allude to that he was also talking to Israelites as well as the Gentiles or the people of the nations, the Greeks or whatever. I mean, I always like to reference 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where it says, that all of your fathers walked under the cloud and was baptized, going through the Red Sea. Well, how can he be talking to Gentiles? Their fathers didn't do that.
Of course, yeah, he went to the synagogue first, so there were Jews in every city. Right.
So he's catching both. He's with this idea that he's the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, that's true, but he was apostle to the nations.
I
And
think it specifically he was the apostle to the Greeks, the Greek-speaking people.
that's possible, yeah.
Yeah,
And
because
that concept of the Greeks, though, too, can be, because you had a lot of the Jews who were Hellenized under
yes,
the Greeks. So that also can still be a reference to talking to maybe Israelites as well. But
oh yeah, I agree. He went to both, but the others were not commissioned to go to the Greek-speaking peoples. They went more north and east,
right.
and there were 12 of them, and they weren't that lazy, I don't think.
Yeah, they got around, I think.
Yeah, so they actually had a humongous work which we don't really pay any attention to.
Yeah, and we don't have the advantage of having it written down, I guess. So
In our Western languages,
right.
there's quite a bit in the Aramaic, and which we could consider as tradition, I guess, in history. But yeah, I just heard what the guy that did the Aramaic English New Testament said he knows for a fact through the librarians at the Vatican that there's a Aramaic New Testament going back to 78 AD.
Wow.
And they just will not let that out. And he confirmed it with two of the librarians that they do have it.
That's incredible.
It is. Which how can we confirm that if the Vatican will not release anything?
Because they probably have something in there that's contrary to their belief.
Well, if you read anything there about Samuel Bakuloki, who did the whole thing about the Sabbath, and he did his research there and cited a lot of the Vatican sources and things. And after that, I don't think they're too keen on letting other people come in there anymore after that. So
yeah, they do keep a lid on things.
Well, again, I appreciate everybody's input. I appreciate all the thoughts, and again, just as a concept to kind of throw out there, I think we get in mind, and it comes probably from our Christian upbringings and things, that this is all just one thing and this is all together, but it's not. It's two separate agreements, two separate covenants, you might say. One was the Israelites agreed to. The other one, while they kind of agreed to, it was really kind of imposed upon them because of what happened with the golden calf incident, and then later, like you mentioned, with Phineas. And so, then I think it helps us as we start reading some of these scriptures in the New Testament to clarify what Paul and others are talking about. And I think helps clarify some of this stuff. I guess for us, the main thing is, with Messiah now comes paid the penalty. Now with the new covenant is restoring us back to the place that they were before at Mount Sinai, before the promises, the covenants of promise going back to Abraham. And so that's what we've got to look forward to. I think that's what's important for us. Now, what parts of the Torah do we still keep and not keep and all that? Well, I think it was mentioned, we don't have per se a Levitical priesthood because there's no temple, there's none of that going on. So those things aren't as pertinent to us. Are they important to us? Again, like I say, I think all Torah, all scripture is good for us. There's things for us to learn from there, concepts for us to learn. I mean, even as far as the tabernacle or the temple, we're supposed to be the temple. So are there things that we need to learn as far as being part of the temple? Is there concepts about the priesthood that we can learn then more about what Yeshua does? Those things are helpful for us.
Very good. Agreed.
I appreciate you guys, everybody's input. Hopefully I didn't make anybody's head spin around. And again, just a thought to look at. And I'll leave it at that, I guess.